Have you ever felt small in the face of gigantic challenges? As if your strength wasn't enough to overcome life's battles? Gideon's story is for you. He was just an ordinary man, insecure and afraid, living in a time of oppression and despair. But God called him, even in the midst of his weakness, to lead an impossible victory. Like Gideon, you may feel pressured by circumstances, thinking you don't have what it takes. However, this story proves that, with faith and obedience, even the weakest can become powerful. Want to know how? Then come and discover how Gideon's courage can be the key to winning your own battles. But before we dive into this journey, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Here, you will find lessons that will strengthen your faith and inspire you to overcome everyday challenges. So, subscribe now and come discover how Gideon's courage can be the key to winning your own battles. Imagine a difficult time for Israel. For 7 long years, the Midianites, a cruel nation, oppressed God's people. They invaded Israel like a swarm of locusts, destroying everything. The people planted their crops, but before they could harvest anything, the Midianites arrived and stole everything: their crops, their animals, their supplies. This left the Israelites in despair and poverty. Out of fear, many hid in caves and in the mountains, trying to protect themselves. Famine spread, and hope seemed lost. The enemies were numerous and merciless, attacking again and again, leaving the Israelites powerless to resist. The reason for this was clear: the people had turned away from God, worshipping idols like Baal and forgetting who had truly freed them from Egypt. As a result, God allowed the Midianites to dominate the land so that the Israelites would understand the importance of returning to Him. After so much suffering, the people finally cried out to the Lord for help. They knew that only God could save them from this oppression. It was at that moment that God began to prepare a liberator, a man named Gideon. Someone simple and unknown, but who would soon become a key player in the liberation of Israel. Gideon's story begins in a setting of fear and oppression. Israel was under the tyranny of the Midianites, who invaded the land and stole everything, leaving the people in despair and hunger. With each harvest, the Israelites saw their hard work being taken away, and hope faded with each passing day. It is in this difficult context that we find Gideon. He was threshing wheat in a winepress, a place normally used to tread grapes. This choice was not by chance. Gideon was hiding, afraid of the Midianites who could appear at any moment and take what he had gained. His every move was careful, reflecting the tension of the moment and the need to survive. Gideon's actions, simple and discreet, reveal a lot about his emotional state. He was an ordinary man, terrified and struggling to keep his family fed. As he dedicated himself to this task, what seemed like an isolated effort was about to turn into something much bigger. God was watching, and in that act of hiding the wheat, Gideon's journey to become Israel's deliverer silently began. In the midst of despair and oppression, an extraordinary moment in Gideon's life was about to occur. As he threshed wheat in the winepress, hidden from the Midianites, the angel of the Lord appeared before him, interrupting his quiet routine. The dark and stuffy winepress was illuminated by the angel's radiant presence. He called Gideon a mighty warrior, a surprising greeting for someone who saw himself as insignificant. Gideon asked, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" Expressing his frustration and doubt about the oppression his people were facing, the angel firmly stated that Gideon would be the one chosen to save Israel from the Midianites. Despite the angel's determination, Gideon still felt insecure and asked for a sign that would confirm that it was indeed God speaking to him. The angel asked him to prepare an offering. Gideon ran home, quickly prepared a young goat and unleavened bread, and brought everything back. When he placed the offering before the angel touched the meat and bread with the tip of his staff, and fire rose from the rock, consuming the offering. Gideon was astonished to realize that he was in the presence of something divine and feared for his life. But the angel calmed him. "Do not be afraid. You will not die." This message brought relief to Gideon's anguished heart. He realized that, despite his doubts, God had chosen him for an extraordinary mission. Thus, Gideon's life would change forever. He would no longer be a man hiding in the winepress and would become the leader who would lead Israel to freedom, the answer to the people's prayers. The encounter with the angel of the Lord planted the seed of faith and courage in his heart, preparing him for the challenges that would come. What would you do if you were in Gideon's place, hiding and afraid, and suddenly God called you a valiant warrior? Have you ever felt that, even in the midst of your doubts, there is a greater purpose for your life? Comment below how this part of the story touched you. What impressed you most about Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord? Let's talk. Having received confirmation of God's calling, Gideon was about to embark on a mission that would require not only courage but also unwavering faith. God had a clear plan. Before confronting the Midianites, Gideon must address the most pressing issue in Israel, the worship of Baal, the pagan god that had taken hold of the hearts of the people. That night, God spoke to Gideon and commanded, "Destroy the altar of Baal that is in your father's house and cut down the Asherah that is beside it." These instructions were clear, but a chill ran down Gideon's spine. He knew that the altar of Baal was not just a physical structure, but a symbol of the people of Israel's unfaithfulness and disobedience to God. The altar had belonged to his own father, Joash, and he wondered, how could he accomplish this task without arousing the wrath of his family and community? But God was on his side, and this knowledge began to warm Gideon's heart. He realized that this was a vital part of his mission, to purify the people before seeking deliverance. So at night, with his heart racing and adrenaline pumping through his veins, he got up and gathered a few men who were as afraid as he was. Together, they made their way to the city in silence. Gideon and his companions arrived at the altar of Baal under the moonlight, and the scene was tense. The altar was surrounded by symbols of pagan worship, with offerings that caught everyone's attention. But Gideon knew he had to act. With renewed courage, he destroyed the altar, smashing the idols that represented Baal worship. Then he cut down the Asherah pole next to the altar, a masterpiece of idolatry that defied the sovereignty of Israel's God. The sound of metal and wood being shattered echoed through the silent night, but Gideon did not hesitate. With each blow, he felt that he was fulfilling God's will and removing the oppression that the people faced. After destroying the altar, Gideon built an altar to the Lord on the same site, using the stones from the altar of Baal. There he offered a sacrifice to God, burning the meat on the wood he had used for the Asherah pole. This act of devotion was a clear sign that he was committing himself to the Lord and no longer to the idols that had led the people into such a deep spiritual downfall. When morning came, news of the destruction of Baal's altar spread quickly throughout the city. The people were shocked and furious to discover that Gideon, Joash's son, had committed such a defiant act against the customs of their family and community. "Who did this?" they asked indignantly. The answer soon came, and the wrath turned against Gideon. Gideon's father Joash defended his son, saying, "If Baal is really a god, let him defend himself. If anyone has a problem with Gideon, let him come and take revenge." With these words, he challenged the people to reconsider their faith and see the weakness of their idols. This courageous act by Gideon was pivotal. He not only tore down the altar of Baal, but he also built an altar to the Lord, establishing a new way of worship. This action would be the first step of many that would lead to the deliverance of Israel. The people began to see Gideon not just as an ordinary man, but as a leader chosen by God, ready to lead them toward true worship and liberation. After facing the indignation of the people and the pressure from his family, Gideon found himself at a crucial moment. He had destroyed the altar of Baal and, with the defense of his father, he had gained a breather, but the real battle was just beginning. He knew he needed strength and courage, and it was at that moment that the Spirit of the Lord descended upon him. Gideon felt a powerful presence and suddenly a wave of courage and determination took hold of his heart. He was no longer just a farmer, but a leader anointed by God, prepared to face the Midianites and free his people from oppression. This transformation was so intense that it seemed as if a new purpose had blossomed within him. With this new strength, Gideon called the men of Israel together. He sent messengers to all the tribes, calling them to join the fight. The message echoed through the mountains and valleys, and many responded to the call. The people began to rally, leaving their insecurities behind, ready to fight for freedom. As the men gathered, Gideon felt more determined than ever. He knew that victory would come not from his own strength alone, but from divine help. With the Spirit of the Lord guiding him, he called out to God for confirmation and guidance. This connection strengthened him even more. Gideon's followers sensed the change in their leader. That timid, hesitant voice now sounded strong and determined, and many felt emboldened as well. Together, they formed an army, ready to confront the Midianites and restore the worship of the God of Israel. Thus, under the influence of the Spirit, Gideon was about to lead his people into a new era of hope and deliverance, determined to dismantle the oppression of the Midianites and restore faith and courage to his people. After being strengthened by the Spirit of the Lord, Gideon still struggled with doubts about his mission to deliver Israel from the Midianites. To get a clearer divine confirmation, he decided to test a fleece of wool. Gideon approached God and prayed, "If you have truly chosen me to save Israel, I will place a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If by morning the dew is only on the fleece and the ground around it is dry, then I will know that you will deliver me from the Midianites." The next morning, Gideon ran to the threshing floor. To his surprise, the fleece was completely wet, while the ground around it was dry. Even so, he still had doubts and thought it might have been a coincidence. So he tested it again. "Lord, do not be angry with you, but please let the fleece be dry this time and the ground around it be wet." The next day, Gideon went to the threshing floor again and found the fleece completely dry, while the ground around it was covered in dew. This clear confirmation strengthened his faith. He realized that God was with him and that his mission was indeed divinely ordained. With these signs, Gideon's confidence grew. He was now convinced that God had chosen him and that victory over the Midianites was possible. The test of the fleece became an important milestone in his journey, symbolizing the intimate relationship he had established with God and preparing him for the challenge that lay ahead. Gideon felt ready to lead his people to liberation. If this story of Gideon has inspired you so far, take advantage and leave a like. This greatly helps the channel to continue bringing content like this, which strengthens faith and makes us reflect. So, click the thumbs up and let's continue this journey together. After receiving God's confirmation through the fleece tests, Gideon prepared to lead the people of Israel against the Midianites. He summoned men from all the tribes, and soon a sizable army had gathered, bringing hope to those living under oppression. However, God spoke to Gideon and revealed a surprising plan. The army needed to be reduced. "You have many people with you," the Lord said. "If you are victorious, you will be able to boast of your own strength. Therefore announce that anyone who is afraid may return home." Gideon, though hesitant, obeyed and made the announcement. To his surprise, more than 20,000 men retreated, leaving only 10,000. Although the number was still significant, Gideon felt the pressure mounting on his shoulders. But God was not finished. He told Gideon, "Lead them to the water, and I will test them there." Gideon led the 10,000 men to the stream. As he watched, he saw that only 300 men were lapping the water with their tongues, while the others knelt down to drink. These 300 men were chosen by God, and Gideon found himself facing a small and seemingly weak army. With only 300 men, the responsibility of leadership weighed heavily on Gideon. However, he began to understand that Israel's true strength lay not in its numbers, but in the faithfulness and power of God. Gideon prepared his small army, determined to show that victory would come from divine intervention, not human strength. With renewed courage, Gideon prepared for battle, knowing that the coming fight would be a demonstration of God's power to both his people and their enemies. He was ready to trust the Lord fully and press forward, even with such a small army. With 300 men chosen, Gideon was about to face one of the greatest challenges of his life. He knew that despite his small numbers, God was with him and that victory would not depend on the strength of his army, but on divine strategy. The Lord had given Gideon a plan that seemed unusual, but which reflected God's wisdom. On the eve of battle, Gideon divided his men into 3 equal groups and placed them in strategic positions around the Midianite camp. Instead of traditional weapons, each soldier was given a musical instrument, a trumpet, and a torch, which would be placed inside a clay jar. The scene was intriguing, men armed with instruments and torches, ready for an attack. This choice may seem strange, but Gideon trusted God. As night fell, tension hung in the air. Gideon signaled his men to prepare. With his heart pounding, he whispered, "Follow me and do what I do." Then, at the sound of their trumpets, Gideon and his 300 men broke the jars, letting the torches shine brightly in the darkness of the night. The sudden blast of the trumpets and the brightness of the torches created an amazing effect of light and sound, confusing and terrifying the Midianites. "By the sword of the Lord and of Gideon," the men shouted, their cry echoing into the night. The deafening sound of the trumpets and the sudden shouts caught the Midianites by surprise. They were so unprepared that they began to panic, confusing one another in the shadows. The Midianite army, which had been so overwhelming, now found itself in disarray, fighting among itself, not knowing who was friend or foe. Gideon watched the scene with wide eyes. The plan that had seemed so absurd was now working perfectly. He had faith that God was working on his side. The terrified Midianites began to flee in despair, and Gideon's men, seeing victory ahead, ran after them, continuing to blow their trumpets and shout. Gideon's astonishing strategy became a testament to the power of God, who used a small group of men to defeat a vast army. The battle was won not by force, but by obedience and faith. Gideon and his men were able to see the hand of God at work, showing that even in impossible situations, he can work miracles when we trust in him. This victory not only freed Israel from the oppression of the Midianites, but also restored the faith and courage of the people. Gideon, now seen as a true leader and man of God, led his people back to worship, reminding everyone that true strength lies in trusting God and being willing to follow his instructions, even when they seem unusual or surprising. After the stunning victory over the Midianites, Gideon and his 300 men were determined to end the oppression that had plagued Israel. Knowing that the Midianite leaders were the root of the problem, Gideon sent messengers to rally other Israelites to join the pursuit. With the Midianites in disarray and fleeing, Gideon led his small force through the valley and over the hills, following the trails of their enemies. Fear had left the Midianites disoriented, and Gideon knew he could not let this opportunity pass him by. During the pursuit, he encouraged his men, reminding them of the purpose of their fight and of God's protection. When they reached the city of Sukkot, Gideon asked for food and supplies, but the leaders were hesitant to help, fearing reprisals from the Midianites. Gideon was determined to promise that those who refused to help would be remembered when he returned victorious. As he continued his search, Gideon spotted the Midianite leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna. With cunning, he set up an ambush and surrounded the enemy, taking them by surprise. The fighting was fierce, but with the strength God had given them, Gideon and his men managed to capture Zebah and Zalmunna, defeating the Midianite leadership. The capture of these leaders marked a turning point. Gideon not only brought freedom to the people of Israel, but also restored hope among them. His victory became a symbol of courage and trust in God, showing that with faith and unity, even the greatest challenges can be overcome. After the resounding victory over the Midianites, Gideon's name spread quickly throughout Israel. The people, encouraged by the liberation and courage of their leader, began to see in Gideon not only a figure of war, but of leadership and even royalty. With the defeat of the oppressors, many Israelites began to gather around him, proposing that he become their king. Faced with this new situation, Gideon found himself in a difficult position. He was approached by leaders and men of influence, who said, "You must rule over us. You saved us from the hands of the Midianites." Hearing this, Gideon felt the weight of responsibility and the honor of such a proposal. However, he knew that the desire for a king should not be satisfied in this way. With the wisdom that God had given him, Gideon answered firmly and clearly, "I will not be your king, nor will my son be your king. The Lord will reign over Israel." He emphasized that true leadership and protection of the people came from God, not from man. Gideon reminded the people that their victory was not the result of human strength or skill, but of divine intervention. This refusal to take the throne surprised many, for the offer of kingship was tempting. However, Gideon had a clear vision of what was right. He knew that an earthly king could lead Israel away from God, leading them into idolatry and away from their true identity as the chosen people. To make his message even clearer, Gideon asked the people to bring him the gold earrings they had collected from the Midianites during the battle. He used them to fashion an ephod, a priestly robe, that was to remind the people that God, not man, was their true leader. Gideon then displayed the ephod in his city as a symbol of Israel's covenant with the Lord. Unfortunately, despite his good intentions, the rejected offer of kingship and the creation of the ephod turned out to be a trap. The people eventually began to worship the ephod instead of remembering God. Thus, Gideon, in his attempt to redirect the focus back to God, unwittingly established a new idol among his people. Yet, Gideon's act of refusing kingship was a powerful testament to his faith and humility. He was a man who sought God's will above his own desires and ambitions. Gideon's story teaches us that in times of triumph, true leadership lies in recognizing God's sovereignty and leading the people in a way that honors and glorifies the Lord. Gideon, the valiant judge who freed Israel from the Midianites, lived many years leading his people with wisdom and faith. However, like everyone else, he also faced his final battle, death. When his time came, Gideon looked at his people, now enjoying peace and prosperity, and felt concern for their future. He had always emphasized the importance of remaining faithful to God, reminding them that their strength came from obedience to the Lord. After Gideon's death, the people mourned and buried him in Ophrah. But soon after his departure, something disturbing happened. Instead of continuing to honor God, many Israelites began to stray from his teachings. Forgetting their history of deliverance, they began to worship idols and seek out foreign gods, imitating the practices of the surrounding nations. This change in attitude had devastating consequences. The generation that grew up without Gideon did not know the great works that God had done for Israel, and they quickly turned away from true worship. Disobedience and idolatry led to division among the tribes, and Midianite oppression began to resurface. Gideon's death not only represented the loss of a leader, but also marked the beginning of a cycle of disobedience and suffering for Israel. Gideon's story teaches us that, even in the absence of leaders, it is essential to maintain faith and devotion to God. The true strength of a nation lies in faithfulness to the Lord and in remembering His works, because forgetfulness can lead to painful consequences. Now that you know the whole story of Gideon, what impacted you the most? Was it the moment when he, full of doubts, asked God for signs? Or when he, with only 300 men, defeated a gigantic army? Comment below which part of this story spoke most to your heart. Let's talk about how Gideon's lessons can help us in our own daily battles. And here we are at the end of Gideon's incredible journey. What this story shows us is that even when we feel weak, afraid, or incapable, God can do something extraordinary through us. Gideon was a simple man, full of doubts, just like many of us. He looked at himself and saw his limitations, but God looked at him and saw his potential. The big message here is that it doesn't matter how big the challenges you face, or how insignificant you feel in the face of them. Just like Gideon, you too can overcome obstacles that seem impossible, as long as you put your trust in God and are willing to act in faith. Gideon teaches us that we don't have to be strong on our own. God is the one who strengthens us. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, powerless, or lost, remember that Gideon was like that too. He was afraid, he doubted, but he decided to trust and follow what God led him to do, and that's what changed everything. This story is not just about victories in ancient battles, it is about the battles we face today, fears, insecurities, and daily challenges. And it shows us that, with God, there is no obstacle too great. If this message touched your heart and you want to continue receiving more inspiring content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we always have stories that strengthen faith and bring valuable lessons for our daily lives. So, click the subscribe button, activate the bell so you don't miss any videos and come be a part of this journey with us. Together, we will explore more stories that can transform lives. Until next time.